The sun had just begun to peek over the eastern horizon, painting Fort Halcyon in a pale gold that glinted off the barbed wire fences and concrete gates. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the perimeter, oblivious to the tension brewing at the main entrance. The morning was cool, the kind of crisp that made every bootstep on gravel echo louder than it should. It was the perfect stage for something unexpected, something unforgettable. Two recruits loitered near the gate, their helmets tucked under their arms, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. Fresh from training, their uniforms still smelled of starch and newness, their belts too tight, their egos too loose. "Hold it right there," barked the taller of the two, his voice loud enough to carry past the metal gates. His eyes squinted against the sunlight, scanning the approaching figure. "You can't just walk onto the base." The woman approaching didn't flinch. She moved with a calm, deliberate pace, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder as though it weighed nothing. A gray hoodie covered her upper body, sleeves rolled slightly, revealing strong, defined forearms. Her boots were scuffed, yet polished with care, an odd combination that suggested both experience and discipline. Her hair, pulled into a tight braid, swung behind her in perfect rhythm with her steps. "Excuse me," she said softly, almost casually, her tone carrying a quiet authority that seemed to cut through the recruit's bravado. The shorter recruit laughed, a high-pitched sound of disbelief. "Yeah, and I'm the president." He stepped closer, puffing out his chest. "Tell me again why we should let you in." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes scanned the gate, the security cameras, the faint glint of the morning sun off the MP's station nearby. Then slowly she focused on the two men in front of her. Her gaze was piercing, like steel sharpened on experience, tempered with patience. "I'm expected," she said. That single statement hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in understatement. The taller recruit smirked. "Expected? Expected by who? And don't get smart with me, lady. You're not walking in here without clearance." There was a pause, a heartbeat too long, too charged. Something in the way she stood, relaxed yet ready, made the recruits uneasy, though neither admitted it aloud. The scars on her knuckles peeked from beneath her sleeves. Faint, subtle, but unmistakable. They told a story the recruits couldn't read, but her presence alone spoke louder than any story could. "Step aside," she said calmly, her voice carrying a weight that made both recruits tense. The first recruit stepped closer. "Or what? You gonna fight us? You're just some." Before he could finish, she moved. Not quickly in a flash, but with precision, a fluidity that made the world seem to slow down around her. She ducked under the shorter recruit's grab, twisting his wrist in a controlled motion. He yelped, stumbling back, pain radiating up his arm. The taller recruit reacted instinctively, swinging to shove her shoulder. He expected resistance, a flinch, a retreat, but there was none. She pivoted, planted her feet, and with a swift sweep knocked him off balance. His boot caught the gravel, sending shards skittering across the concrete, and he crashed to the ground with a thud that echoed like a gunshot in the early morning silence. Around them, the base continued its routine, oblivious at first. A coffee cup slipped from a guard's hand, clattering to the ground. Engines revved in the distance. The rhythmic pounding of boots in training cadence paused, soldiers turning their heads toward the commotion. She stepped back, breathing steady, her eyes scanning the two recruits sprawled in the gravel. "I warned you," she said softly, almost regretfully. Her voice was calm, yet each word carried the undeniable weight of authority, experience, and a hint of admonishment. You just assaulted us." The taller recruit screamed, scrambling to his knees, shock overtaking his bravado. "We're reporting this. You're done." Her gaze shifted, and the air around her seemed to tense, coiling like a spring. She crouched slightly, a subtle preparation as though waiting for the inevitable. Then she spoke, low and deliberate. "No," she said, "you are." From behind, sirens wailed. Armed MPs sprinted toward the gate, weapons raised, shouts tearing through the early morning calm. On the ground now. Her compliance was immediate. Hands behind her head, calm as stone, she followed every command without hesitation. But even as the cuffs clicked around her wrists, something about her posture, the way she held her chin, projected power, a silent warning that this was far from over. A sergeant pushed through the growing crowd, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. One glance at her face, at the quiet strength radiating from her frame, and he froze. Then, almost involuntarily, his voice broke the tension. "Stand down," he whispered to the MPs. Then louder shaking, "Stand down." The base froze. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The sergeant approached her carefully, his hand extended in a gesture of deference. "Welcome back, General Mercer," he said, voice almost trembling. The words struck like a thunderclap. Every soldier near the gate froze in stunned silence. The recruits on the ground paled, their jaws slack. They had thought they were facing an ordinary stranger, just some civilian bold enough to talk back. Instead, they had challenged the highest-ranking officer on the base. Her cuffs were removed instantly. She stood, brushing gravel from her sleeves, her expression calm but stern. The morning sun glinted off her medals now revealed beneath her unzipped hoodie, a subtle display of rank and reputation. She surveyed the two recruits still lying on the ground. "Get them to medical," she ordered. Her voice was firm, even unyielding. "Then bring them to my office." Nearby soldiers whispered to each other, eyes wide. Some laughed nervously. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief. No one had ever seen anything like this. Two recruits thinking they could intimidate a stranger at the base gate, only for that stranger to not just survive the encounter, but dominate it without effort. She adjusted the strap of her duffel and turned toward the base entrance. The gate guards, the MPs, the sergeant, even the astonished recruits, they all moved in tense, obedient silence. Every movement around her seemed slow and deliberate, as if the world itself had recalibrated to the presence of General Evelyn Mercer. In that moment, Fort Halcyon learned a truth that would ripple through its ranks for years. Some lessons cannot be taught in classrooms or training drills. They must be experienced firsthand. And General Mercer had just delivered one. The recruits, still on the ground, looked at each other, shame, fear, and disbelief written across their faces. They had walked into the base confident, cocky, ready to prove themselves, and instead they had stumbled headfirst into a storm named Evelyn Mercer. As she moved toward the office, sergeant at her side, the first recruit whispered, barely audible, She's the general." "Yes," the second stammered, still clutching his arm, "the general." And somewhere deep inside, both of them realized that nothing in their training had prepared them for what had just happened, and nothing would ever prepare them for what came next. The base gates hummed behind her, guards and soldiers resuming their duties, but a subtle tension lingered in the air. A storm had passed, but its ripples remained, touching every recruit, every officer, every soldier on that base. The morning sun climbed higher, but no one outside could see the storm brewing within. Not yet. Because this was only the beginning. The gravel under the recruits' boots still rattled in their ears as they stumbled to the side, clutching sore wrists and elbows. Their confidence, once loud and sharp like gunfire, had evaporated into a stunned silence. Around them, soldiers and gate personnel whispered, some gawking, others shaking their heads in disbelief. But the recruits barely noticed. Their attention was fixed on the woman who had just disarmed, toppled, and humiliated them with precision that felt almost supernatural. She stood a few feet away now, adjusting the strap of her duffel. Her movements were calm, measured, the embodiment of control. Every exhalation, every blink, every shift of weight was deliberate, like a predator studying its prey, yet somehow restrained. It was terrifying in its subtlety. One recruit finally tried to speak, his voice breaking. What are you?" She looked at him, a flicker of pity crossing her otherwise unreadable face. "I told you I'm expected," she said softly. Her tone carried no malice, only the cold, unshakable authority of someone who had faced far worse than two foolish teenagers on a gravel path. The taller recruit, still clutching his arm where she had twisted his wrist, let out a shaky laugh. "You're crazy, that was insane." "Insane?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Or necessary?" Her words hung in the morning air, and the recruits felt the weight of them without fully understanding. They had thought this was a challenge they could win through brute force and bravado, and yet here they were, sprawled on the cold gravel, humiliated and hurt. The humiliation burned worse than the pain. A gate guard, still frozen with a radio in his hand, finally broke the spell. "Sir, ma'am, do we arrest them?" The woman turned her gaze to him, eyes sharp and focused. "No, but ensure they learn properly." The guard hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." Even as the recruits tried to rise to their feet, she stepped forward again. One move, one small, measured shift. It wasn't a threat, it was inevitability. They froze again, realizing that resistance was useless. She wasn't here to argue, she was here to teach. "Stand still," she instructed, and both recruits obeyed, their eyes wide, pulses racing. She crouched slightly and examined them in a manner that made every officer nearby stop in their tracks. Her fingers hovered over their injuries, not to touch, but to remind them of her presence. Her very being was a lesson in authority. "You're lucky," she said, her voice low, yet carrying across the gate. "Most people who try to intimidate me never get the chance to apologize." The taller recruit swallowed hard. "Lucky," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," she said, "lucky that I am patient, lucky that I value discipline more than revenge." A tense silence followed. Even the wind seemed to pause. The recruits were left with a stark realization. They had misjudged the wrong person, and the consequences could have been far worse. Then came the sound that truly made their hearts stop, the roar of approaching sirens. Armed MPs, fully alert, rounded the corner at a run, weapons ready, shouting commands that echoed off the gates and barracks. On the ground now. The recruits froze again, but to their astonishment the woman complied immediately. Hands raised slowly, as if surrendering were a form of meditation, not defeat. The guards lowered their weapons slightly in disbelief, expecting perhaps a struggle, a fight, anything. None came. Within seconds the metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. She remained calm. The recruits' knees shook as they processed what was happening. She was compliant, but the aura of authority she carried had not diminished. Every eye on the gate felt it. Even the sergeant who had first recognized her seemed to shrink slightly in her presence. Then a voice broke the stunned silence. "Stand down," whispered the sergeant, a tremor of awe and fear in his tone. Then louder with authority, "Stand down, all of you." The MPs froze in place. Weapons lowered. The base seemed to collectively exhale, the tension shifting from panic to bewildered respect. The sergeant approached the woman cautiously, his eyes wide. "Welcome back, General Mercer." The words struck like lightning. Every soldier, recruit, and guard froze. The two young recruits who had thought themselves the epitome of courage stared at each other in horror. Their jaws slack, their knees weak. They had just been dominated by a stranger, who was, in fact, the highest-ranking officer on the base. Her cuffs were removed instantly. She stood brushing gravel from her sleeves, now revealing a crisp uniform underneath the unzipped hoodie. Medals glinted in the morning sun, each one a story, a mission completed, a life saved, a battle won. The recruits could barely comprehend the gravity of the moment. They had just crossed someone legendary. She surveyed them calmly, her eyes sharp. "Get them to medical," she instructed, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Then bring them to my office." The recruits moved like shadows, numb and obedient. They had no choice. Even if they had wanted to resist, the magnetic pull of her presence made resistance impossible. Around them, whispers erupted. Soldiers and guards exchanged glances. Some shook their heads in disbelief, Others laughed nervously. The story would spread across Fort Halcyon faster than wildfire. 2 recruits had challenged a stranger, and the stranger had not just defended herself but obliterated their arrogance with surgical precision. Her eyes, now calm again, scanned the base's perimeter. Gate guards, MPs, sergeants, everyone was watching. Even at a distance, her presence radiated a quiet command that demanded attention. It was the kind of authority that could silence a riot or rally a battalion. The taller recruit whispered to the shorter one, voice trembling. Did you hear that? She's the general." "Yes," the other stammered, still clutching his arm. "The general." They looked at each other, faces pale, realization dawning. They had walked into the base with bravado, thinking themselves untouchable, and now faced the reality that nothing in their training had prepared them for this moment. The sergeant led General Mercer toward the office, her steps calm, measured, deliberate. Behind them, soldiers resumed their duties, but a subtle tension lingered in the air. The entire base had just witnessed an event that would be retold for years. The day 2 recruits underestimated a legend. Even as she moved away, the recruits' fear remained. Their initial humiliation had evolved into something deeper, a gnawing respect, tinged with terror, for the woman who had dominated them without raising her voice, without losing her composure, and without the slightest hint of anger. Somewhere deep inside, they realized the day had not ended. This was only the beginning of their reckoning. The storm they had unleashed on themselves by challenging the stranger was only gathering strength, and General Mercer was its eye, calm, unyielding, and deadly precise. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the base. But those shadows now carried a warning. Respect was earned, not demanded, and anyone foolish enough to test that lesson would learn it the hard way. Behind closed doors, the office awaited. The recruits, still pale and shaking, would soon discover that the battle had only just begun, not with fists, but with discipline, authority, and the unrelenting force of a leader who expected nothing less than total accountability. As General Mercer disappeared into the office, the gate behind them hummed with resumed activity. Yet the echoes of what had just happened lingered in every corner of Fort Halcyon. Whispers, glances, and quiet conversations carried the story. A stranger, a fight, 2 humbled recruits, and a general who had just reminded everyone that legends walked among them, even when they wore a simple gray hoodie. The recruits sat in stunned silence in medical, both nursing their injuries and the deeper, sharper sting of humiliation. Every nerve in their bodies screamed a warning. They had underestimated power, authority, and experience. And tomorrow, they would pay the price. Because this was only the beginning. The moment General Mercer stepped into the office, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just authority or rank, it was presence. Every footstep seemed to echo with invisible weight, every pause charged with expectation. The recruits, escorted by a sergeant whose hands trembled ever so slightly, followed behind, their shoulders slumped, their heads low. They had seen her at the gate. They had felt her control, her lethal precision, the calm yet terrifying efficiency in her movements. But seeing her now in full uniform, metals gleaming in the morning light filtering through tall windows, made the reality hit harder. This was no ordinary officer. This was General Evelyn Mercer, the living embodiment of legend within the walls of Fort Halcyon. The office itself was imposing. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with military histories, strategy tomes, and volumes on leadership. Maps of past operations, pinned and annotated meticulously, adorned a section of the room. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, a mixture of discipline and meticulous care. "Sit," Mercer said, her voice calm but unyielding. She gestured toward the chairs across from her desk. The recruits obeyed instantly, the weight of their previous arrogance now a tangible burden pressing them into the leather seats. The sergeant lingered near the door, eyes darting between the general and the recruits. He looked as if he feared even a sudden twitch could provoke disaster. Mercer walked to her desk, laid her duffel down with precision, and opened it. Inside were her personal notes, schedule for the week, and a small tablet displaying operational updates. She tapped a few commands, but her attention never left the recruits. "You have questions," she said simply. The taller recruit swallowed hard. His voice was barely audible. "Ma'am, why didn't you identify yourself at the gate?" She regarded him steadily. "Because respect," she said slowly, "should never be demanded, it should be earned." Silence fell. The words seemed to settle over them, heavier than any punishment, heavier than any drill. The recruits realized their mistake wasn't just underestimating her strength, it was underestimating authority itself, the power of experience and command that wasn't proven by titles alone. The shorter recruit fidgeted, his hands clenching in his lap. We thought we could handle it," he stammered. "We didn't know." "No," Mercer replied, her tone even but sharp, slicing through the fog of excuses. "You didn't know, and now you do, and knowing is only the first step toward understanding." Her eyes bore into them, not with anger, but with a precision that felt like it could cut steel. Every muscle, every motion, radiated calm control. The recruits flinched under her gaze. For the first time, they truly understood what it meant to face someone whose life had been forged in fire, someone whose authority had been earned in battle, in strategy, in command of lives, in decisions that weighed more than any individual ego. She walked around the desk slowly, deliberately, giving them no escape from the realization settling over them. "You've learned the hard way," she said. "Sometimes lessons aren't gentle. Sometimes lessons are immediate, unmistakable, and unforgettable." Both recruits tried to speak, to defend themselves, but the words faltered. Every syllable seemed inadequate, too small, too meaningless in the presence of someone who had walked through war zones, commanded elite units, and emerged unbroken. Mercer paused by the window, hands clasped behind her back. The sun had risen higher, casting long rays across the office. Dust motes floated lazily in the light, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. She spoke again, voice low but resonant. "You are on this base to learn discipline, teamwork, and humility. Yesterday, you failed every measure simultaneously." The recruits shivered. "We were sorry, ma'am," the taller one managed. "We didn't know." "Don't apologize for ignorance," Mercer said, turning toward them. "Apologize for arrogance. Apologize for underestimating what you cannot yet understand, and then earn your way forward." The shorter recruit's eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from the crushing realization of how utterly exposed they were before someone who could, and would, see through every false bravado, every empty gesture, every inflated sense of self. "Your behavior yesterday," Mercer continued, "was more than a lapse in judgment. It was a lapse in character. Leadership does not forgive such lapses easily, but you will learn, or you will fail spectacularly." The recruits nodded, swallowing hard. The gravity of the words sank in like lead in their chests. They had thought Fort Halcyon would be about drills, about following orders, about demonstrating physical skill. They hadn't realized it was about character, about respect, about understanding that the uniform they wore represented more than themselves. It represented history, responsibility, and lives entrusted to their hands. A long silence followed. Mercer's gaze softened slightly, though the edge never dulled. She pulled a small tablet from her desk, scrolling through schedules. "You will begin immediate corrective training. You will be evaluated daily. Every failure, every misstep will be documented. Every success must be earned through effort, discipline, and humility. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," both recruits chorused. Their voices lacked confidence. Their bodies bore the weight of the lesson already delivered and of the one yet to come. "Good," Mercer said, closing the tablet and leaning against her desk. "But understand this. Learning is not just about obedience. It's about comprehension, about understanding consequences, about internalizing the fact that actions, no matter how small, ripple outward. She paused, letting the silence amplify her words. Yesterday, you learned that the wrong action can have immediate consequences. Tomorrow, you will learn how to correct it. And the day after, you will learn why this base functions because of discipline, not bravado. One recruit dared a glance at his companion. Their eyes met, wide and sober, understanding that their journey had just begun. They had survived the first confrontation, but survival was not mastery. Respect was not yet earned, and General Mercer's shadow loomed large over every waking moment on the base, a constant reminder of the standards they had yet to meet. Finally, Mercer turned to leave the room. "The rest of the base will hear of this event soon enough," she said over her shoulder. "Consider it an opportunity, not for humiliation but for growth. Fail publicly and the lesson is harsh. Succeed and it is lasting." The sergeant followed her out, the recruits trailing behind, heads low, their bodies tense. As they passed through the corridors, whispers spread like wildfire. 2 recruits had challenged a stranger. That stranger had overpowered them with precision. And that stranger was General Evelyn Mercer. By the time they reached the parade ground, the story had already traveled through the ranks. Soldiers turned to look, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others exchanging smirks or chuckles. But the recruits could feel the weight of judgment in every glance. They weren't just learning a lesson in authority. They were learning about legacy, about legend, about a reputation forged through years of experience and immeasurable responsibility. And yet, amidst the humiliation, fear, and awe, there was a spark, tiny, fragile, but unmistakable. A spark of curiosity. A spark that whispered, maybe, just maybe, they could survive this, learn from it, and grow. But first, they would have to endure the next chapter of General Mercer's teaching. Because even as the sun climbed higher, casting light over the base, one undeniable truth settled over Fort Halcyon. A storm had passed through the main gate yesterday, and its ripples were far from over. General Mercer had arrived, and the recruits, along with the rest of the base, would never forget it. And somewhere deep in the ranks, a murmur began to spread. Who else underestimates her? Who else will learn the hard way? The suspense hung thick in the air, heavier than the early morning fog that had already begun to burn off. The recruits knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that their reckoning was far from over, and the rest of the base would witness it unfold. This was only the beginning. The following morning, a chill hung over Fort Halcyon, the kind that made the early sunlight seem pale and fragile. Soldiers shuffled into formation on the parade ground, boots scraping against the concrete with military precision, rifles held at their sides. Thousands of eyes fixed on the center of the base, where a lone platform had been erected, rising just enough to give anyone standing atop it complete visibility over the mass of troops. Word had traveled quickly. Everyone knew why the assembly had been called. Whispers darted like lightning across the rows of soldiers. 2 recruits had challenged a civilian. That civilian had not just bested them, she had humiliated them with surgical precision. And that civilian was the general, Evelyn Mercer. Even the most hardened soldiers felt a twinge of curiosity, coupled with unease. Stories of her exploits were legendary. Tales of entire operations turned around, of ambushes anticipated, of enemy units defeated with nothing but strategy, precision, and unwavering command. And now she had arrived, not in a ceremonial capacity, not in a parade of medals, but in a way that reminded every soldier of her authority, her presence, and her absolute command over life, discipline, and consequence. The platform creaked faintly under the general's boots as she ascended. Mercer wore full ceremonial uniform, her chest adorned with medals that shimmered under the morning sun. Every step was deliberate, every movement precise. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the wind stilled, as if to witness history. She paused at the center of the platform. Her gaze swept across the formation, slow and deliberate. The 2 recruits, still pale from the morning's events, were brought forward, heads bowed, their pride thoroughly shattered. They looked small beneath the towering presence of the general, dwarfed not just by her physical stance, but by the aura of authority she radiated. "Discipline," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. It was firm, calm, and resonant, carrying across the entire parade ground. "Is not about fear, it is about respect." Every soldier felt the weight of those words. It wasn't a command, it was a truth, a principle, something they had been taught in drills but would only truly understand through experience. Her gaze turned to the recruits. "Yesterday, 2 of you forgot that." The taller recruit flinched. The shorter one swallowed hard. Their humiliation was raw, exposed, undeniable. The soldiers around them watched, some sympathetically, others smirking, but all fully aware of the lesson being delivered. Mercer's eyes swept back to the assembled troops. "You didn't challenge a woman," she continued. "You challenged the values of this uniform, the principles upon which this base, this unit, and this military stand." A murmur ran through the ranks. The recruits' mistake had become a symbol, a cautionary tale that would echo far beyond their individual folly. She stepped forward slightly, pointing a single gloved finger toward the 2 recruits. "I don't punish weakness, I punish arrogance. And make no mistake, your arrogance yesterday endangered far more than yourselves. It endangered the integrity of this base, the trust placed in each of you, the discipline that keeps us alive and effective in the field." Her voice dropped to a low, almost dangerous level. "If you think I'm done with this lesson, you are mistaken. The cost of your failure will be paid publicly, not for humiliation, but so that every member of this unit understands that actions have consequences, and respect is not optional." The recruits' knees shook. Their humiliation was total, complete, and yet it was not cruel, it was instructive, shaping them into something greater than themselves. They had been chosen for correction, not destruction, but the magnitude of the lesson was terrifying. Mercer turned, slowly packing across the platform. Her boots clicked against the metal, a deliberate metronome marking the gravity of her words. "You will rise from this lesson stronger, wiser, and more disciplined, or you will continue to fail. Every step forward will be earned, every success earned, every failure witnessed." The soldiers standing in formation felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. They had seen discipline in action countless times, but rarely in such raw, immediate, and unforgettable form. Mercer's presence alone commanded attention, respect, and fear, blended seamlessly into a single, undeniable force. She paused again, allowing her words to sink deep into the ranks. Then her gaze returned to the 2 recruits. "You will be placed under the most rigorous training regimen on this base. Every movement observed, every action evaluated. Fail once and the consequences will be immediate. Succeed and it will be noted but never assumed as permanent." Her voice softened slightly, though the intensity remained. "This is not vengeance. This is preparation. You are not being punished for yesterday, you are being prepared for every day that follows, for the battlefield, for the responsibilities that your uniform demands." The recruits looked at each other, eyes wide with terror and awe. They realized, perhaps for the first time in their lives, the magnitude of what it meant to wear the uniform, to carry the responsibility, and to face the consequences of their actions in front of everyone they served alongside. The assembled soldiers watched in silence, understanding that this was more than a lecture or a reprimand. It was a live demonstration of leadership, discipline, and the weight of command. Some whispered, some nodded subtly, but all were absorbing the lesson. Even the most seasoned officers could feel the electric tension, the weight of authority that Mercer carried without effort. Finally, she raised her hand, signaling the end of the public part of the lesson. The recruits were escorted to their new assignments under her supervision, their path forward clear but daunting. The soldiers began to disperse, their formations breaking, conversations rising, but the story had already embedded itself in the collective memory of the base. By midday, whispers had spread beyond the parade ground. Cafeterias, training grounds, and barracks all buzzed with the tale. 2 recruits had challenged a stranger at the gate. That stranger had defeated them with precision. That stranger was General Evelyn Mercer, and the lesson was far from over. But as the recruits walked away, shoulders slumped, minds reeling, a subtle transformation had begun. Fear was tempered with respect, humiliation with understanding. Their arrogance had been dismantled, and in its place, the seeds of discipline were being sown. And General Mercer, standing once more at the platform, watching them leave, allowed herself the smallest of nods. The first part of her lesson had been delivered. The recruits had been exposed, humbled, and set on a path they would not forget. But the storm was not yet complete, for the ripple effect of yesterday's gate confrontation would touch every corner of Fort Halcyon in the days to come. The recruits' failure had become a lesson for the entire base, a story of hubris, consequence, and the relentless standard of a general who demanded nothing less than excellence. As she descended from the platform, soldiers could feel it, Mercer's gaze, sharp and unyielding, tracking every movement, every posture. It was a silent reminder that discipline was constant, vigilance unending, and respect not given lightly. And somewhere deep in the hearts of the 2 recruits, a faint, tremulous thought took hold. We may survive this, but can we truly earn her respect? Because the day had ended, yes, but the journey had only just begun. The 2 recruits were escorted to their new assignments immediately after the assembly. The sun had climbed higher, but it did little to warm the chill that followed them. Every step felt heavier than the last, their boots dragging across the concrete as if gravity itself had increased. They weren't just walking to training, they were walking into the consequences of their arrogance. General Mercer's eyes followed them from the platform until they disappeared into the corridor. She didn't speak, didn't issue further commands. Her presence alone was enough to communicate what awaited: discipline, accountability, and an unflinching standard that would leave no room for excuses. The recruits arrived at the harshest training area on base. It was a section notorious for producing some of the most disciplined soldiers in Fort Halcyon's history. Rows of obstacle courses, shooting ranges, and endurance drills stretched as far as the eye could see. The officers in charge of the facility had already been informed. This was no ordinary reassignment. These 2 recruits would be pushed further than any others, their every movement observed, their every failure recorded, and their every success demanded. "Start with the endurance course," barked one of the supervising sergeants, his eyes sharp. "Do not stop, do not falter, do not complain, every misstep is noted." The recruits obeyed, though their bodies screamed. Muscles that had never been tested in this manner quivered with fatigue. Breath came in ragged gasps, every fiber of their being ached. Every instinct begged them to stop, but stopping was not an option. Not here. Not under the shadow of General Mercer's judgment. Hours passed. Mistake after mistake was catalogued. Every stumble, every fumble, every hesitation, logged, reported, analyzed. Yet even as their bodies burned, a strange realization began to form. This wasn't cruelty. This wasn't revenge. This was instruction. A brutal, merciless instruction, yes, but instruction nonetheless. By the end of the day, both recruits were spent. They collapsed on the ground, heaving, drenched in sweat, dirt covering every exposed inch of skin. Yet amidst the exhaustion, a subtle shift had occurred. They were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had underestimated. They were beginning to understand the weight of discipline. And perhaps, even the smallest flicker of respect for General Mercer's methods had begun to ignite in their hearts. But not everyone viewed her approach favorably. That evening, as the recruits were escorted back to the barracks, an anonymous complaint had been filed. The allegations were serious: excessive force, abuse of power, personal vendetta. Names were withheld, motives unknown. Yet the accusation was enough to trigger an immediate investigation. General Mercer was informed that night. She listened quietly as the sergeant relayed the details. "It's anonymous," he said, his voice uneasy. but it's serious enough that the board will review it." Mercer's expression remained calm, unreadable. "Do they understand what discipline is?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am," the sergeant replied. "Good," she said. "Then the truth will speak for itself." The investigation opened the next morning. Officers gathered in the boardroom, footage from the gate replayed on large screens. Every movement, every word, every action analyzed and scrutinized. General Mercer sat silently, hands clasped, eyes calm and unflinching. She did not flinch. She did not plead. She did not need to. Her actions had been deliberate, precise, and fully within the bounds of military conduct. The recruits were called in to testify. Trembling, exhausted, and still humbled, they spoke. "She didn't abuse us," one said. "She saved us from ourselves." Another added, voice quivering, "We didn't understand, but she made us understand." The board listened, impassive, but the room itself seemed to shift as the words sank in. The two recruits were no longer just subjects of investigation. They had become witnesses to the truth of General Mercer's leadership. Her actions, while intense, had been corrective, necessary, and ultimately life-saving in a professional sense. Outside the boardroom, the base buzzed with speculation. Soldiers whispered in hallways. Some questioned her methods, others defended them fiercely, but all felt the undercurrent of something more profound. The presence of a leader who demanded excellence, who measured not just skill but character, and who enforced accountability with unwavering precision. Meanwhile, the recruits were placed under continuous evaluation, every mistake logged, every improvement noted. General Mercer personally oversaw their progress. Her gaze was relentless, sharp, and thorough. There was no room for deception, no space for shortcuts. Every action required effort, focus, and integrity. Days turned into weeks. The recruits' bodies grew stronger, their reflexes sharper, their discipline absolute. The fear that had first consumed them transformed into determination. They learned to anticipate, to plan, to execute, not for praise but for mastery. They were no longer the same recruits who had laughed at a stranger at the gate. They were evolving, reshaping, becoming reflections of the standards they had once scorned. And yet, even as they progressed, the shadow of the investigation loomed. The board would issue its verdict soon, and while the recruits' transformation was undeniable, there was always a lingering tension. Would the bureaucracy understand the necessity of Mercer's methods? Would the anonymous complaint be dismissed, or would it tarnish the reputation she had built over decades? The recruits did not dare ask. They understood their place. Their focus remained on the daily drills, the endless evaluations, and the unspoken expectations of the woman who had changed the course of their careers in a single morning. General Mercer, for her part, remained stoic. She did not gloat. She did not belabor the recruits' mistakes. She allowed them to struggle, to fail, and to rise on their own terms. Her method was subtle in its intensity. She created conditions under which they had no choice but to grow or remain stagnant and be left behind. By the end of the 5th week, both recruits had undergone transformations that surprised even the most seasoned officers. They moved with precision, executed drills flawlessly, and carried themselves with a newfound humility. They had earned incremental respect, not just from their peers but from themselves. And somewhere deep within, they began to realize that General Mercer's fury, or her precise discipline, was not personal. It was a reflection of the standards she lived by, and the standards she demanded from those who served under her command. And yet, for all their growth, they remained nervous. The threat of scrutiny, the shadow of the complaint, the weight of history, all of it lingered in the corners of their minds. They knew that the final judgment from the board would be decisive. Their personal evolution was only part of the equation. The formal vindication, or condemnation, of General Mercer's actions would shape the rest of their careers. But for now, as they returned from another grueling day, both recruits moved in silence. They carried not just the physical exhaustion of training, but the mental weight of understanding the cost of arrogance and the responsibility of earning respect. And somewhere beneath the fatigue, a flicker of something else emerged: determination. They would not fail again. Because failure under General Mercer was no longer just personal, it was public. And the lessons learned here, at Fort Halcyon, would follow them for the rest of their lives. As night fell over the base, Mercer stood alone on the platform, looking out over the sprawling training grounds. Her gaze was steady, unyielding, scanning the grounds like a hawk over its territory. The recruits were in the barracks, resting and recovering. But her mind was already on the next step, the next lesson, the next opportunity to forge discipline from raw talent and humility from arrogance. The storm had passed, but its ripples continued. The base had witnessed the beginning of a transformation, not just of 2 recruits, but of the culture itself. And General Mercer, ever calm, ever precise, ever relentless, knew that the real test was only beginning. Because discipline, once sown, must be nurtured, and respect, once demanded through example, must be earned through experience. And for those 2 recruits, the consequences of yesterday's arrogance would continue to shape every action, every decision, and every heartbeat for months to come. The base slept uneasily that night, for even in rest, the shadow of General Mercer loomed large, reminding all who served here. Authority was not given lightly, and the cost of underestimating it could be staggering. Tomorrow, the investigation would continue, and the next phase of their lesson would begin. But for now, the recruits understood one unshakable truth: they had survived the storm. They had endured the lesson, and they would never again mistake legend for an ordinary presence. The boardroom at Fort Halcyon was cold, sterile, and imposing. Its walls, lined with polished wood and the subtle gleam of brass plaques commemorating past commanders, seemed to magnify every sound: the creak of chairs, the shuffling of papers, even the quiet hum of the overhead lights. Officers in full dress uniforms sat around a long table, their expressions unreadable masks of authority and procedure. The air smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and the lingering tension of unspoken judgment. General Evelyn Mercer entered the room with a quiet confidence that immediately demanded attention. There were no dramatic gestures, no flamboyant entrance. She simply walked in, boots clicking against the polished floor in precise rhythm, her uniform immaculate, her medals reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. Every head turned. Every officer felt it. This was not just a general. This was a legend incarnate, a woman whose authority was absolute and whose judgment was precise. The sergeant who had escorted the 2 recruits stood behind her, trying to mask his unease with rigid posture. The recruits themselves followed, still pale from weeks of relentless training, their every nerve alert, their bodies tense with both fear and anticipation. They knew this hearing could decide not just Mercer's career, but also the reputation they had begun to rebuild under her guidance. The board called the session to order. The lead officer, Colonel Bradford, adjusted his glasses and spoke first. "General Mercer, you are here to answer allegations of misconduct filed against you regarding the incident at the main gate involving 2 recruits. You will have the opportunity to respond to the claims, after which witnesses may be called." Mercer nodded once, calm, collected, and unwavering. "Understood, Colonel." The first video clip was played on the large screen at the head of the room. Grainy footage from the gate security cameras showed the confrontation in detail: the recruits' arrogant posturing, the shoves, and then the swift, precise maneuvers by Mercer that left them on the ground, humiliated and injured. Every movement, every expression, every calculated action was visible. Colonel Bradford's tone was clinical. "Did you intend to cause injury to the recruits, General?" Mercer's gaze remained steady. "No," she said firmly. "I intended to demonstrate consequences. I intended to ensure they understood the seriousness of challenging authority and undermining discipline. At no point was harm my objective beyond the minimal physical contact necessary to establish control." The room was silent for a moment, the officers exchanging subtle glances. Mercer's calm and precise wording left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Yet the tension was palpable, the stakes high, the outcome uncertain. Colonel Bradford leaned back in his chair. "Why did you not identify yourself immediately at the gate? Would that not have prevented the incident entirely?" Her eyes met his, unwavering. "Respect should not be given based on rank alone. It must be earned. If I had identified myself, the recruits may have complied out of fear or protocol, not understanding. They would have missed the lesson. Discipline, accountability, and humility cannot be taught through fear. They must be experienced." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some officers nodded subtly. Others shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the depth of wisdom in her approach, even if the method was unorthodox. Then the recruits were called forward. Trembling, exhausted, and still carrying the marks of their earlier confrontation, they took seats in front of the board. One of them, the taller recruit, spoke first. His voice was low but steady. "She didn't abuse us," he said. "She saved us from our own arrogance. We thought we could handle it. We couldn't. She made us understand what it means to wear this uniform responsibly." The shorter recruit nodded vigorously. "We didn't understand at first, but after training, after following her guidance, we realized she was teaching us, not punishing us. I respect her for it." There was a pause. The officers processed the statements. The recruits' honesty, humility, and acknowledgement of personal growth carried more weight than any video footage or testimony could. Mercer's actions, while aggressive in appearance, were now contextualized by their effectiveness and the transformative results they had produced. Colonel Bradford leaned forward. "So you assert that your methods, while intense, were appropriate given the circumstances?" "Yes," Mercer replied. "Appropriate and necessary. My responsibility is to ensure the development of effective, disciplined, and accountable soldiers. These recruits were given an opportunity to learn a lesson that could not be ignored or postponed. Every step was measured, every action considered. The objective was not punishment for its own sake, but correction and growth." The board reviewed additional footage, reports, and witness statements. Each piece reinforced Mercer's meticulous approach. Her movements were deliberate, calculated, and executed with full awareness of the boundaries of acceptable conduct. The recruits' statements underscored the effectiveness of her methods, highlighting not fear or harm, but growth, respect, and learning. Finally, Colonel Bradford closed his folder and addressed the board. "General Mercer, your actions have been scrutinized extensively. You have provided testimony, evidence, and context. Witnesses, including the recruits, have corroborated your account. This board recognizes the precision, effectiveness, and necessity of your actions. Do you have any further statement before the board deliberates?" Mercer's gaze swept across the room, calm and unwavering. "Discipline is not always comfortable. Leadership requires difficult decisions. Authority is not given, it is earned. And the lesson learned yesterday, while uncomfortable for those involved, serves a purpose far greater than immediate comfort. That is all I have to say." Silence fell over the room. The weight of her words, combined with the evidence presented and the recruits' testimonials, left the officers in quiet contemplation. It was clear that Mercer's actions were not only justified but exemplary of leadership under pressure. The board adjourned briefly to deliberate. In the corridor outside, whispers spread among officers. The general had faced scrutiny and had emerged unscathed. More than that, she had demonstrated why she was one of the most respected commanders in Fort Halcyon's history. When the board reconvened, Colonel Bradford's voice broke the tension. "General Mercer, the board has reached a unanimous decision. Your actions were necessary, measured, and in accordance with military conduct. The complaint has been dismissed in full. Furthermore, the board commends your leadership, foresight, and effectiveness in turning an immediate crisis into a valuable learning experience." A ripple of relief passed through the room. The recruits, still pale, exhaled for the first time in weeks, realizing that the shadow of doubt had lifted. They had not only survived the scrutiny but had witnessed, firsthand, the power and precision of a leader who commanded respect without compromise. Mercer inclined her head, acknowledging the verdict with quiet dignity. "Thank you," she said simply. No triumph, no boast, just the calm acceptance of a mission completed. Outside the boardroom, the base buzzed with the news. Soldiers whispered, some in awe, others in quiet reverence. The story of the gate confrontation, the recruits' arrogance, and the general's decisive intervention spread like wildfire. It became more than a tale of discipline. It became a legend, a testament to what leadership looked like in action. The recruits, escorted back to their training quarters, felt a profound shift within themselves. Fear had transformed into respect. Humiliation had been reshaped into understanding. The weeks of grueling training under Mercer's relentless supervision had not been punishment, they had been preparation. And now, with the board's verdict, their journey toward mastery could continue, guided by a leader whose methods were as exacting as they were transformative. General Mercer, standing alone for a moment on the platform outside the boardroom, watched the recruits as they disappeared into the corridors of the base. Her gaze was steady, unyielding, and full of quiet authority. She had faced scrutiny, demonstrated her effectiveness, and reinforced the standards she demanded. The storm had passed once again, but the ripples of yesterday's confrontation would continue to influence every corner of Fort Halcyon. Because leadership, she knew, was not measured by comfort or popularity. It was measured by results, by discipline, and by the ability to transform arrogance into humility, fear into respect, and recruits into soldiers capable of meeting the highest standards. And in that quiet moment, the legend of Evelyn Mercer grew just a little larger. The base would never forget it. The sun was dipping low over Fort Halcyon, casting long shadows across the parade ground. The golden light illuminated every surface, highlighting the perfect precision of the formation of soldiers standing at attention. There was a tension in the air, thick enough to feel, as if the entire base was holding its collective breath. Today was the day the recruits would face the final judgment, not just from the board, but from the general herself. Word had traveled quickly. General Mercer's methods had been scrutinized and her leadership vindicated by the board. But for the recruits, the verdict was more than procedural approval. It was personal, tangible, and carried the weight of the past weeks' relentless training. The two recruits, still pale and exhausted, were brought forward to the center of the parade ground. Their boots scuffed against the concrete, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet. Every soldier present watched, anticipation rippling through the ranks like a current. They knew this was more than a ceremony. It was a lesson in respect, discipline, and accountability. General Mercer stepped onto the platform, her posture impeccable, her expression calm yet radiating unshakable authority. The medals on her chest caught the fading sunlight, glinting sharply, reminders of her legacy and experience. Every eye in the formation, every soldier and officer, seemed drawn to her, aware that they were witnessing more than a simple verdict. They were witnessing leadership in its purest, most intense form. She surveyed the recruits, taking in every detail. Their stance, the way they held themselves, the tension still lingering in their shoulders. She didn't speak immediately, letting silence build anticipation. Even the wind seemed to pause, the rustle of leaves replaced by the quiet murmur of hundreds of soldiers holding their breath. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, resonant, and authoritative, carrying across the entire parade ground. You have undergone weeks of training designed not just to test your physical limits, but to challenge your character, your judgment, and your understanding of responsibility. Yesterday, you were untested. You acted with arrogance, underestimating authority and risking more than you realized. Today, you have earned the opportunity to demonstrate the lessons learned. The recruits swallowed hard, hearts pounding. The memory of their initial confrontation at the gate, the humiliation, the pain, the relentless training, was fresh. They felt the weight of every lesson she had imparted, every correction, every observation. "You have trained," Mercer continued, "and you have demonstrated perseverance, discipline, and growth. Your efforts have not gone unnoticed." A murmur ran through the formation. Soldiers shifted, exchanging glances, recognizing the rare moment unfolding before them. For the recruits, every word was both reward and reminder. The journey had been grueling, but it was far from over. Mercer gestured toward the taller recruit. "You have shown remarkable improvement in both execution and judgment. Your understanding of discipline has grown. Your respect for your uniform, your peers, and your leaders is evident. You have earned the right to continue serving without further censure." The recruit's knees nearly buckled. Relief, pride, and lingering fear collided in a single surge of emotion. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging her words, knowing they were earned, not given. Then she turned to the shorter recruit. "You have demonstrated humility, perseverance, and the capacity to internalize correction. Your progress has been steady, and your commitment to improvement undeniable. You, too, are cleared to continue your service, carrying with you the lessons of accountability and respect." The second recruit's eyes shimmered with tears he fought to contain. Weeks of hardship, weeks of doubt and fear, were distilled into a single moment of acknowledgement from the one person whose judgment mattered most. The formation erupted, not with loud applause but with the quiet, disciplined acknowledgement of soldiers recognizing achievement and mastery. Nods, subtle shifts of stance, murmured words of respect. The message was clear. These recruits had transformed, and the general's methods had proven effective beyond question. Mercer's gaze swept across the parade ground, taking in every soldier present. "Let this serve as a reminder to all who serve here. Arrogance has consequences. Discipline is earned. Respect is not demanded but cultivated. Every action, every choice, every misjudgment has ripple effects. Learn from these lessons. Let the example of these two recruits inspire vigilance, humility, and growth." The recruits were dismissed, but not before Mercer offered a final word, her tone carrying both authority and subtle warmth. "Carry these lessons forward, not as punishment endured, but as wisdom gained. You are no longer the soldiers who challenged me at the gate. You are different now, stronger, wiser, and prepared for what lies ahead." As they walked back to the barracks, the recruits felt an overwhelming mixture of relief and pride. They had survived the crucible, endured every consequence, and emerged transformed. But the lesson was deeply ingrained. Respect and authority were not to be taken lightly, and leadership demanded both humility and vigilance. Soldiers along the way watched, some nodding subtly, some whispering among themselves. The story of the gate confrontation had become legend, a narrative of transformation that reinforced the standards of the base and the authority of General Mercer. By the time night fell, the recruits were alone in the barracks, reflecting on the journey that had changed them forever. Every ache in their bodies, every bruise, every moment of fear and doubt, they now understood it as part of the process, the forging of character, and the cultivation of respect. Mercer's presence lingered in their minds, not as a shadow of fear, but as a beacon of authority and discipline. Her methods had been precise, calculated, and unyielding, but they had also been instructive, transformative, and ultimately just. And somewhere deep within, they knew this was only the beginning of what it meant to serve under such a leader. The lessons would continue, the challenges would persist, and the shadow of General Mercer's presence would remain with them at every step, every decision, every action. In the quiet of the night, one recruit finally whispered to the other, "We survived, but we'll never be the same." The other nodded, eyes wide and reflective. "No, and that's the point." Outside, the base settled into an uneasy calm, soldiers aware that while the immediate storm had passed, the ripple effects of the confrontation, the training, and the verdict would shape the culture, discipline, and respect of Fort Halcyon for years to come. And at the top of the command tower, General Mercer watched silently, eyes sharp, mind alert, already anticipating the next challenge. the next lesson, and the next opportunity to forge excellence from ambition, arrogance, and inexperience. The legend of Evelyn Mercer continued to grow, not through fear alone, but through unwavering authority, precise judgment, and the undeniable power to transform those who dared underestimate her. The verdict had been delivered, the lesson had been learned, but the legacy, the imprint of her leadership, would endure far longer than any single confrontation, shaping every soldier who walked the grounds of Fort Halcyon for generations to come. The recruits had survived the crucible. They had been tested, transformed, and vindicated. But one truth remained etched in their minds forever: never underestimate a general, never challenge authority without understanding the consequences, and never forget the lessons of discipline, respect, and humility. And with that, the base exhaled, the shadows of the day fading into night, leaving only the enduring presence of a leader whose power, precision, and authority would never be forgotten. Weeks passed since the verdict, but the echoes of the confrontation at Fort Halcyon's main gate were far from fading. The story had spread across the base like wildfire: two recruits who had challenged a stranger, only to discover she was General Evelyn Mercer, and the lesson that had followed. Soldiers spoke of it in hushed tones in the barracks, whispered during training, and recounted at the mess hall. Every retelling carried the same moral: discipline, respect, and authority were not abstract concepts. They were lived, measured, and enforced by those who understood their weight. The two recruits had settled into their routine, but they were no longer the same individuals who had laughed and sneered at the gate. Their bodies were leaner, stronger, and more resilient, their reflexes sharper, their discipline absolute. Yet the most profound changes were not physical. They had learned humility, patience, and the value of measured action. Arrogance had been stripped away and replaced with respect, not just for General Mercer, but for every soldier, every officer, and every responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. Every day they trained under Mercer's watchful eyes, her presence constant, precise, and unyielding. But something subtle had shifted. No longer did they tremble in fear at her proximity. Instead, they felt a steadying force, a guiding hand. Her scrutiny, once terrifying, now served as a compass, pointing toward excellence, toward self-discipline, and toward the embodiment of the principles the base demanded. One morning, the recruits were called to the central training grounds for a demonstration. The entire base gathered, soldiers standing in formation, officers observing from the perimeter, and new recruits lining the edges, eyes wide with anticipation. Mercer had arranged an exercise that would test the recruits' abilities to lead, coordinate, and execute under pressure, the culmination of weeks of intense training. The exercise began. The recruits, now leaders in their own right, commanded small teams through complex maneuvers, balancing strategy, timing, and communication. Each movement was precise, each order clear, each execution measured. For the first time, the recruits were not just participants, they were authorities, applying the lessons learned under Mercer's unrelenting guidance. Observers watched in awe as the teams navigated simulated combat scenarios, executed obstacle courses, and completed tactical challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. The recruits moved with confidence, discipline, and composure. Mistakes were minimal, and when errors occurred, corrections were immediate, precise, and constructive. Mercer observed from the platform, her eyes scanning every detail, nodding subtly as progress was made. By the end of the exercise, the recruits' teams had completed every challenge flawlessly. Mercer descended from the platform, approaching the recruits with a measured, deliberate pace. She stopped in front of them, her gaze calm yet commanding. "You have done well," she said simply. "Not because you followed orders, but because you understood them. Not because you feared consequences, but because you internalized the lessons of responsibility, discipline, and respect. You have transformed from individuals who challenged authority to leaders capable of inspiring it." The recruits swallowed hard, emotions swirling, pride, relief, and a deep, humbling sense of accomplishment. Mercer's words were not mere praise, they were validation, acknowledgement that the long, grueling weeks of training, discipline, and reflection had produced results. She continued, addressing the assembled soldiers. Let this exercise stand as an example. Leadership is not a title. Discipline is not enforced by fear alone. Respect is not demanded. It is earned through action, accountability, and unwavering commitment. These two recruits exemplify what can be achieved when guidance is followed, lessons are learned, and humility tempers ambition. A murmur of approval swept through the formation. Soldiers exchanged glances, nodding in recognition of the transformation they had witnessed. The recruits' journey had become a lesson for all, a living testament to Mercer's methods and her capacity to shape individuals into disciplined, capable soldiers. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the sprawling hills surrounding the base, the recruits returned to the barracks. Mercer's presence lingered in their thoughts, not as a shadow of fear, but as a guiding force, a benchmark of excellence they now aspired to reach. They reflected on the journey that had begun with arrogance and ended with mastery, humility, and understanding. In the quiet of the barracks, one recruit spoke softly. "I can't believe how far we've come. Weeks ago, I wouldn't have imagined this, not just surviving, but actually learning, leading, and earning respect." The other nodded, eyes thoughtful. "She didn't just push us, she made us face ourselves, every weakness, every mistake, and made us stronger because of it." Outside, General Mercer walked the perimeter of the base, observing the soldiers under her command. The sun cast long shadows, highlighting the discipline and precision evident in every movement, every formation, every drill. She paused for a moment, surveying the grounds with quiet satisfaction. The recruits' transformation was a small part of a larger legacy, a culture of discipline, excellence, and respect that extended throughout Fort Halcyon. Mercer's thoughts turned inward. Leadership was not about glory or recognition. It was about shaping others, demanding excellence, and creating an environment where mistakes became lessons, weaknesses became strengths, and arrogance became humility. Every recruit, every soldier, every officer was part of this ongoing process, a living testament to the standards she upheld. Word of the recruits, transformation continued to spread, reaching every corner of the base. New recruits arrived with heightened awareness, veterans watched with quiet respect, and officers recognized the enduring impact of Mercer's leadership. The story of the gate confrontation, the relentless training, and the eventual transformation of two wayward recruits became legend, a benchmark for future generations. For the recruits themselves, life had fundamentally changed. They carried the lessons of the past weeks into every exercise, every interaction, and every decision. Their confidence was tempered by humility, their strength by discipline, and their ambition by respect. They were no longer reckless youth. They were soldiers, shaped and tested by the unyielding hand of one of the finest leaders in Fort Halcyon's history. As night fell, the base settled into a quiet rhythm. The recruits, exhausted but transformed, reflected on the journey that had redefined them. They had survived not just a confrontation, not just grueling training, but an experience that would echo through their careers and lives. And at the center of it all stood General Mercer, a figure of authority, wisdom, and unrelenting precision, whose presence ensured that the lessons learned would endure far longer than any single confrontation. In the weeks, months, and years to come, every soldier at Fort Halcyon would carry the legacy of this event in some form. They would recall the story of two recruits who underestimated authority, faced the consequences, and emerged transformed under the guidance of a leader whose standards were absolute. And for Mercer herself, the legacy was quiet but undeniable. It was not written in reports or medals alone, but in the transformation of those who had faced her, learned from her, and grown stronger because of her unwavering commitment to discipline, respect, and excellence. The recruits knew, as did everyone at Fort Halcyon, that authority, when wielded correctly, could forge heroes. And General Evelyn Mercer had demonstrated this with precision, patience, and an unyielding hand. As the base lights flickered on, illuminating the paths, buildings, and training grounds, a subtle truth settled over everyone. Leadership is not about being seen. It's about being remembered, and the legacy of those who demand excellence is eternal. The recruits had been tested, humbled, and transformed. The base had witnessed history in the making, and General Mercer, ever vigilant, ever precise, ever legendary, remained the unwavering force at the heart of it all, a beacon of authority whose influence would shape Fort Halcyon for generations to come. The lesson had ended, the legacy had begun.